In the winter of 1944, an entire German army group began to collapse not in summer heat, but in temperatures that froze engines, rivers, and men in place. What started as a Soviet counterstrike near Zhitomir turned into a 180-kilometer pursuit that erased Germany's last defensive system in central Ukraine. The question is not how the front broke, but why it could never be rebuilt again. The Zhitomir-Berdichev winter offensive unfolded in a strategic environment shaped by the first large-scale reversal of German fortunes on the Eastern Front. By December 1943, the balance of initiative in the war had shifted decisively following the Soviet victories at Stalingrad and Kursk earlier that year. The Red Army had regained operational momentum across a broad front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. In Ukraine, German Army Group South had been forced into a continuous series of defensive withdrawals throughout the summer and autumn, culminating in the loss of key bridgeheads east of the Dnieper. The liberation of Kyiv on 6 November 1943 marked a major political and military milestone and created the forward operational base for new Soviet deep operations into right bank Ukraine. For the German command, the loss of Kyiv represented a fundamental rupture of the Eastern defensive system. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, was stretched across a front exceeding 1,200 kilometers. Its formations were already depleted after months of defensive combat, with infantry divisions reduced to 50–60% of their authorized strength. Armored formations retained core striking power, but suffered from fuel shortages, limited replacements, and the cumulative effects of attrition. German operational reserves in Ukraine by December 1943 consisted primarily of the 1st Panzer Army, elements of the 4th Panzer Army, and several understrength infantry corps. On the Soviet side, the liberation of Kyiv allowed Stavka to initiate the next phase of its winter strategic plan, designed to dismantle the German defensive system west of the Dnieper and regain control of central and western Ukraine. Two major operational groupings were positioned for the next offensive phase: the 1st Ukrainian Front, under General Nikolai Vatutin, and the 2nd Ukrainian Front, under General Ivan Konev. Together, these fronts fielded more than 1.9 million personnel along a 450-kilometer sector. They were supported by approximately 2,300 tanks, over 26,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and nearly 2,000 combat aircraft. German forces opposing them in the Zhitomir-Berdichev axis included the 4th Panzer Army and elements of the 1st Panzer Army, with a combined strength of approximately 450,000 to 500,000 men, supported by about 550 tanks and assault guns. This disparity in manpower and firepower reflected the broader strategic shift that had occurred during 1943. However, German defenses were deeply layered and supported by extensive field fortifications constructed during the autumn defensive phase. National interests on both sides converged sharply in this sector. For the Soviet Union, the recovery of right bank Ukraine held direct strategic value due to its industrial potential, agricultural production, and rail infrastructure connecting Eastern Europe to the Balkans. Politically, the continued liberation of Ukrainian territory reinforced the Soviet narrative of irreversible German retreat. For Germany, retaining a defensive line west of the Dnieper remained essential for protecting access routes to Poland, Slovakia, and Romania, as well as securing remaining economic resources extracted from occupied Ukrainian territory. Military preparedness for winter warfare varied sharply between the two sides. The Red Army had conducted extensive reorganization during the autumn of 1943. Newly raised rifle divisions replaced formations destroyed earlier in the year. Tank and mechanized corps were re-equipped with increasing numbers of T-34s and Su self-propelled guns. Artillery units received improved communication equipment and standardized fire control systems based on combat experience. Winter clothing stocks were prioritized following the logistical failures of 1941 and 1942. By December 1943, Soviet formations in the Zhitomir-Berdichev sector had arrived at near full operational readiness. German preparedness for winter combat remained uneven. While experienced units retained high tactical coherence, shortages of winter clothing, fuel lubricants suitable for extreme cold, and replacement vehicles were already evident by early December. Rail supply routes from Poland into Ukraine were increasingly interrupted by partisan activity, and Luftwaffe transport capacity was insufficient to compensate for rail disruptions. Public sentiment in Soviet-liberated Ukraine reflected a complex mixture of exhaustion, displacement, and expectation of continued fighting. Millions of civilians had been evacuated eastward since 1941, and large areas of central Ukraine lay devastated by 2 years of occupation and combat. Nonetheless, Red Army advances during the autumn created strong anticipation of full liberation. German-controlled territories west of the advancing front experienced intensified labor mobilization, forced construction of defensive lines, and accelerated evacuation of industrial equipment. By mid-December 1943, both sides understood that the fighting in central Ukraine had entered a new phase. The Red Army had completed the transition from strategic defense to sustained strategic offense. The German command faced the necessity of trading space for time under winter conditions. The Zhitomir-Berdichev axis, linking Kiev with western Ukraine, now emerged as the geographic focus where this confrontation of strategic trajectories would next unfold. On 24 December 1943, the Red Army launched the opening phase of the Zhitomir-Berdichev winter offensive under conditions of sustained frost, snow cover, and limited daylight. The First Ukrainian Front initiated the main attack from bridgeheads west of Kyiv along a 100-kilometer sector stretching from Radomyshl to Fastiv. The initial shock grouping included the 38th Army, 1st Guards Army, 18th Army, and the 1st Guards Tank Army. These forces were supported by more than 800 tanks and self-propelled guns and over 9,000 artillery pieces and mortars allocated specifically for the breakthrough sector. At 8 WAR local time, after a 90-minute artillery preparation involving massed fire against German forward positions, Soviet assault formations advanced through snow-covered terrain with temperatures below 15 degrees Celsius. Visibility was limited to 800, 1,000 meters in most sectors. German forward trenches and strongpoints were partially frozen, complicating both defense and immediate counteraction. Within the first 6 hours, Soviet infantry penetrated the first German defensive belt to depths of 4 to 6 kilometers in multiple sectors. German units opposing the initial assault belonged primarily to the LVI Panzer Corps and 20th Army Corps of the 4th Panzer Army. These formations fielded understrength infantry divisions supported by limited armored reserves held 20 to 30 kilometers behind the front. German artillery response during the opening day was constrained by ammunition shortages and frozen firing mechanisms, which reduced sustained rate of fire. By the evening of 24th December, Soviet forces had achieved tactical penetration across a frontage exceeding 40 kilometers. On 25th of December, Soviet mechanized forces were committed into the widening breach. Forward brigades of the 1st Guards Tank Army advanced through corridors cleared by infantry, bypassing isolated German strongpoints and driving westward toward Brusilov and Andrushivka. Average advance rates on the second day reached 12 to 18 kilometers, despite heavy snow accumulation and limited road capacity. German rear security units were forced into rapid displacement without reinforcements sufficient to stabilize the penetration. German command reacted by ordering emergency redeployment of mobile reserves from secondary sectors. Elements of the 8th Panzer Division and 19th Panzer Division were redirected toward the breakthrough zone beginning on 26 December. However, rail movement was disrupted by partisan sabotage and Soviet air interdiction. The first armored counterattacks reached the front only after delays of 24 to 36 hours. By 26 December, Soviet forces liberated Radomyshl and advanced toward Zhitomir from the northeast. German rear area communication networks came under sustained attack by Soviet fighter-bomber aviation, which flew more than 600 combat sorties during the first 3 days of the offensive. German vehicle losses from airstrikes during this phase exceeded 300 trucks and fuel carriers, further reducing mobility of rear units. Within Zhitomir itself, German command initiated controlled withdrawal preparations by 26 December, evacuating supply depots and demolishing selected bridges over the Teteriv River. Rearguard detachments were assigned to delay the Soviet approach, while armored units assembled west of the city for a defensive stand. By the end of 26 December 1943, the opening phase of the Zhitomir-Berdichev offensive had concluded, with the Soviet forces firmly established inside the first operational depth of German defenses. A continuous breakthrough zone had been created, and German command now faced the necessity of choosing between counterattack under winter constraints or a broader strategic withdrawal toward the western Ukraine defensive line. By the final week of December 1943, both Soviet and German commands had fully defined their strategic objectives for the unfolding winter campaign in central western Ukraine. For the Soviet High Command, the Zhitomir-Berdichev axis represented a critical operational gateway into the depth of right bank Ukraine. Stavka's intent was not limited to a localized breakthrough near Kyiv. The broader objective was the destruction of the German 4th Panzer Army, the fragmentation of Army Group South into isolated groupings, and the forced withdrawal of German forces toward the pre-war borders of Poland. The offensive was designed as a deep operational strike rather than a positional advance, with mobile formations tasked to penetrate 150-200 kilometers into the German rear within a matter of weeks. The First Ukrainian Front under General Vatutin was designated as the main striking force. Its task was to break the German defensive system between Zhitomir and Bila Tserkva, seize Berdichev and Fastiv, and create the conditions for the encirclement of German formations retreating from the Dnieper line. The Second Ukrainian Front under General Konev was assigned the supporting role to the south, with instructions to advance toward Kirovohrad in coordination to prevent German reserves from stabilizing the front. The combined operational concept relied on synchronized pressure across multiple axes to prevent the German command from establishing a coherent fallback defense. Soviet logistical preparation for the winter offensive reached unprecedented levels compared to earlier years of the war. Between mid-November and late December 1943, more than 120,000 railcars delivered ammunition, fuel, food, winter clothing, and replacement equipment into the rear areas of the First Ukrainian Front. Fuel reserves allocated for the opening phase exceeded 95,000 tons, sufficient to sustain large-scale mechanized operations for several weeks. Artillery ammunition stocks reached an average of 2.5 basic loads per gun in the breakthrough sector. Engineer units stockpiled over 300 modular bridge components for rapid river crossings during exploitation. German strategic planning faced fundamentally different constraints. Army Group South no longer possessed the freedom to conduct large-scale counteroffensives. The directive issued by Hitler in mid-December prohibited operational withdrawals beyond selected defensive lines and required the retention of key transportation hubs at all costs. Field Marshal Manstein repeatedly requested freedom of maneuver to conduct elastic defense and localized counterstrokes, but these requests were increasingly denied. German planning therefore focused on delaying actions, limited armored counterattacks against Soviet penetrations, and the stabilization of a continuous defensive line west of Zhitomir and along the Bug River approaches. German supply planning operated under escalating logistical stress. Fuel allocations for the entire Army Group South in late December averaged below 60% of formal operational requirements. Rail deliveries from Upper Silesia and western Poland were disrupted by partisan attacks at a weekly rate exceeding 20 major incidents. The Luftwaffe was incapable of providing large-scale airlift support due to aircraft losses earlier in 1943 and shortages of transport fuel. German artillery ammunition reserves along the Zhitomir sector were sufficient for no more than 5 to 7 days of intensive defensive fire. Weather conditions were fully integrated into both sides' planning. Soviet meteorological services forecast sustained sub-zero temperatures through January, allowing reliable movement of heavy armor across frozen rivers and marshland that had previously restricted maneuver. German command anticipated similar mobility, but faced problems with frozen engine lubricants, cracking fuel lines, and increased vehicle maintenance attrition. During December alone, more than 35% of German non-combat vehicle losses in the sector were attributed to cold-related mechanical failure rather than combat damage. Propaganda planning accompanied operational preparations. Soviet political departments prepared public announcements for the liberation of major cities expected to fall during the first weeks of the offensive, including Zhitomir and Berdichev. German propaganda emphasized the concept of a temporary winter setback and portrayed retreat as a pre-planned defensive maneuver designed to shorten the front. These narratives reflected not battlefield realities, but the psychological dimension of a confrontation whose outcome was becoming increasingly dependent on operational depth and material endurance. By the closing days of December 1943, strategic preparation on both sides had reached its conclusion. The Red Army had assembled the mass, logistics, and mobile formations required for sustained offensive warfare in winter conditions. The German command faced a defensive struggle defined less by the ability to stop the Soviet advance than by the challenge of managing retreat under continuous pressure. The next phase would convert this confrontation of plans into sustained combat across the frozen plains of central Ukraine. The first major engagements of the Zhitomir-Berdichev winter offensive unfolded between 27 December 1943 and 1 January 1944, as Soviet mobile forces expanded the initial breakthrough into a series of rapidly developing battles across the frozen road network of central Ukraine. Following the penetration achieved during the opening phase, the 1st Guards Tank Army and forward rifle divisions of the 38th and 18th Armies drove westward toward Zhitomir and southwest toward Berdichev, aiming to shatter German rear area cohesion before organized defensive lines could be restored. On 27 December, Soviet forward tank brigades reached the outskirts of Zhitomir from the northeast after advancing more than 40 kilometers in 3 days. German rearguard formations, primarily from the 208th and 68th Infantry Divisions, attempted to conduct delay actions along the Tateriv River line. These units were supported by scattered assault gun detachments and field artillery batteries operating under ammunition restrictions. Fighting developed around river crossings at Denishi and Slobodka, where Soviet engineers constructed rapid ice crossings under artillery fire. By the evening of 28 December, Soviet forces had forced multiple crossings and outflanked the remaining German defensive positions east of the city. Zhitomir was entered by Soviet forward detachments on 30 December 1943 after 2 days of street-level fighting involving infantry supported by T-34 tanks and self-propelled artillery. German forces executed an organized withdrawal toward the west, demolishing key bridges and depots before retreating. Soviet records indicate the capture of large stocks of damaged German vehicles, food stores, and engineering supplies inside the city. German losses during the defense of Zhitomir between 27 and 30 December are estimated at approximately 2,000 killed and wounded, with an additional 1,300 taken prisoner. Soviet casualties in the same period reached approximately 4,500 killed and wounded. Simultaneously, fighting intensified along the southern axis toward Berdichev. Between 28 and 31 December, formations of the 1st Guards Army advanced through Chervonoarmeysk and Andrushivka under heavy snow conditions. German delaying groups attempted to slow the advance using minefields, anti-tank ditches, and artillery fire from prepared fallback positions. However, frozen ground reduced the effectiveness of field obstacles, and Soviet engineers rapidly breached defensive works under fire. Average daily Soviet advance in this sector reached 15 to 20 kilometers despite constant skirmishing. Civilian impact in the first engagement phase was immediate and severe. Towns and villages along the advance routes changed control within hours. Thousands of civilians emerged from abandoned cellars and field shelters as Soviet troops entered urban centers. In Zhitomir alone, post-liberation Soviet commissions recorded more than 4,000 civilian deaths from occupation-related causes between 1941 and 1943, in addition to several hundred killed during the final days of German withdrawal and artillery exchanges, German command attempted to stabilize the front using armored counterattacks. On 31st December, elements of the 8th Panzer Division launched a counterstroke east of Berdichev involving approximately 60 operational tanks. The attack achieved a temporary penetration into Soviet forward rifle units, but was halted by concentrated anti-tank fire from Su-76 and Zis-3 batteries. German armored losses in this engagement reached at least 18 tanks destroyed or disabled. Soviet losses exceeded 900 killed and wounded. Morale during this early phase diverged sharply. Soviet formations advanced with increasing operational confidence after months of defensive fighting. German units reported growing strain from continuous withdrawal, frozen terrain, and reduced mobility. However, tactical resistance remained consistent at battalion and regimental levels, particularly in urban blocking positions and along river crossings. By 1st January 1944, the first engagement phase of the offensive had concluded with the liberation of Zhitomir, the partial isolation of Berdichev from the north and east, and the continued westward displacement of German defensive lines. The front had shifted more than 80 kilometers in several sectors within 1 week. The offensive now entered a phase of rapid expansion, as both sides committed additional forces to a battle that was no longer limited to breakthrough, but had become a full-scale operational confrontation across the winter landscape of central Ukraine. By the beginning of January 1944, the escalation phase of the Zhitomir-Berdichev winter offensive was fully underway. The rapid Soviet advance following the fall of Zhitomir created a widening operational gap in the German defensive system, forcing Army Group South into a sequence of emergency reactions. The stabilization of the front now depended on the ability of German mobile reserves to slow the Soviet exploitation before deeper rear area communications were severed. Between 2 and 6th of January, Soviet forces expanded their offensive frontage to more than 200 kilometers. The 1st Guards Tank Army advanced west of Zhitomir toward Novorod-Volinsky, while the 38th and 18th Armies pressed southward toward the rail junctions leading into Berdichev. Daily advance rates varied between 10 and 22 kilometers, depending on terrain and resistance. Snow depth reached 40 to 60 centimeters in many sectors, complicating movement for both sides, but favoring Soviet forces, which now possessed greater numbers of tracked vehicles and fresh transport units. German command reacted by assembling an emergency strike group centered on the 8th Panzer Division, 19th Panzer Division, and elements of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division. This group, totaling approximately 280 tanks and assault guns, was tasked with counterattacking along the Berdichev axis to prevent Soviet forces from severing the rail corridor linking Vinnytsia to the northern front. On 4th January, German armored units launched a coordinated counterstrike northeast of Berdichev. Initial contact resulted in close-range tank engagements under poor visibility conditions caused by blowing snow and freezing fog. The counterattack achieved partial tactical effect. German armored units temporarily regained several villages and disrupted Soviet forward supply columns. However, these gains could not be sustained. Soviet artillery regrouped rapidly, deploying massed fire from newly established winter firing platforms. Within 48 hours, German armored formations lost more than 60 vehicles destroyed or disabled, primarily due to anti-tank artillery and mechanical breakdowns caused by extreme cold. Soviet losses in tanks and self-propelled guns during the same engagements reached approximately 45 vehicles. Infantry casualties on both sides during 4-6 January exceeded 6,000 killed and wounded combined. Logistical strain intensified sharply. German fuel stockpiles in the Zhitomir-Berdichev sector fell below 40% of required daily consumption by 5th January. Rail deliveries from western Ukraine were repeatedly delayed by damaged track and partisan sabotage. Soviet logistics also faced severe challenges. Roads were frequently blocked by snowdrifts and abandoned wreckage. Horse-drawn transport was reintroduced on a massive scale to compensate for vehicle losses. Field depots advanced forward at a pace that often exceeded the establishment of reliable supply hubs. As a result, several Soviet tank brigades reported fuel shortages lasting up to 24 hours during pursuit operations. Command and control difficulties multiplied. German formations conducted staggered withdrawals without continuous lateral coordination, leading to temporary exposure of flanks between neighboring corps. Soviet formations, advancing at different speeds due to terrain variation, experienced gaps exceeding 15 kilometers between adjacent armies at several points during the first week of January. These gaps increased the risk of local encirclement, but were exploited rapidly by German mobile reserves only in limited measure due to fuel and ammunition shortages. Civilian impact escalated as the fighting spread westward. Populated centers that had been under German occupation for more than 2 years now fell into the active conflict zone. Between 3 and $10 January, more than 120 villages and small towns changed control at least once. Civilian casualties increased due to artillery exchanges, air attacks on transport routes, and the destruction of housing during rearguard actions. Forced evacuations organized by German authorities during the initial withdrawal phases displaced tens of thousands of civilians westward under winter conditions. Weather compounded operational exhaustion. Temperatures fluctuated between 10 degrees Celsius and 20 degrees Celsius across the first 10 days of January. Frostbite cases increased among both Soviet and German troops. Hospitals in newly liberated towns were overwhelmed by combined civilian and military casualties. Frozen ground restricted the burial of the dead, leading to temporary mass graves near field medical stations. Politically, the escalation drew increasing attention from Allied command structures. Soviet progress in central Ukraine raised concern within the German leadership about the stability of the entire southern flank of the Eastern Front. Simultaneously, Western Allied intelligence began assessing the likelihood that German reserves might be further diverted eastward at the expense of defenses in Italy and Western Europe. By 7th of January 1944, the escalation phase had reached its critical threshold. German counterattacks had failed to restore a continuous defensive line east of Berdichev. Soviet forces continued to expand their penetration in multiple directions, despite mounting logistical strain. The confrontation now approached a decisive phase in which the battle would be determined not by localized counterstrokes, but by the endurance of entire army groups under deep winter conditions. The peak phase of the Zhitomir-Berdichev winter offensive unfolded between 8 and 14 January 1944, when both sides committed the bulk of their remaining operational reserves in an effort to either complete or contain the deep Soviet breakthrough. By this stage, the front between Zhitomir, Berdichev, and Fastiv had transformed into a continuous zone of mobile battles fought under sustained frost, deep snow cover, and extreme logistical strain. Soviet forces sought to convert their earlier penetrations into an irreversible collapse of the German 4th Panzer Army's central defensive grouping. On 8 January, the 1st Guards Tank Army resumed its westward thrust with 2 tank corps and 1 mechanized corps deployed in the lead. The objective was to reach the approaches to Novohrad-Volhynsky and cut lateral rail communications, supporting German forces retreating from the Berdichev sector. More than 420 Soviet tanks and self-propelled guns were committed to this phase. Despite fuel shortages affecting several brigades, advance rates recovered to 12 to 16 kilometers per day, as German rearguards were forced into successive withdrawals under combined tank, artillery, and air attack. German command concentrated its main defensive effort along the Berdichev-Koziatin rail corridor, which served as the final organized supply and evacuation route for forces still engaged east of Vinnytsia. Between 9 and 11 January, elements of the 19th Panzer Division, reinforced by assault gun brigades and remnants of 2 infantry divisions, launched repeated counterattacks to stabilize this axis. These actions involved approximately 140 operational German armored vehicles at their peak. Engagements developed into close-range tank battles under snowfall and freezing fog, reducing effective engagement distances to less than 600 meters in many sectors. Losses during this period were sustained and heavy on both sides. Between 8 and 12 January, German armored units in the Berdichev sector lost an estimated 70 to 90 tanks and assault guns destroyed or disabled. Soviet armored losses during the same period are estimated at 85 to 110 vehicles, primarily from anti-tank artillery fire and mechanical breakdowns under cold stress. Infantry casualties during the peak phase exceeded 15,000 killed and wounded on both sides combined. On 10 January, Soviet forces entered Berdichev after German rearguards executed staged demolitions of rail facilities, bridges, and supply depots. The city was secured after 36 hours of street fighting involving rifle divisions supported by self-propelled artillery. German losses during the defense and withdrawal from Berdichev are estimated at approximately 3,500 killed and wounded, with more than 1,800 taken prisoner. Soviet casualties in the city fighting reached approximately 5,000 killed and wounded. The capture of Berdichev removed the last major German strongpoint east of the Vinnytsia defensive belt. Civilian conditions at the peak of the campaign deteriorated sharply. Large portions of Berdichev's population had been evacuated during earlier occupation phases, yet more than 20,000 civilians remained in the city during the final engagements. Water supply infrastructure was severely damaged by demolitions, and electrical power ceased for several days. Food reserves were minimal, and Soviet military authorities had to divert frontline rations for emergency civilian distribution during the first week after liberation. German command attempted one final operational stabilization effort on 12-13 January by shifting remnants of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division into a blocking line southwest of Berdichev. This line held for less than 48 hours before being outflanked by Soviet mechanized units operating over frozen secondary roads, previously considered unsuitable for heavy armor. By 14th January, the German defensive structure in the Zhitomir-Berdichev sector had fully transitioned from organized line defense into staggered rearward displacement toward the Bug River approaches. By the end of 14th January 1944, the peak of the campaign had passed. The German 4th Panzer Army no longer possessed the operational cohesion needed to restore a continuous forward defense in central Ukraine. The Soviet forces, despite significant losses and growing supply difficulties, had secured their primary urban objectives and broken the last major organized defensive belt east of Vinnytsia. The outcome of the offensive was no longer in doubt. What remained was the process of German withdrawal under pressure and the consolidation of a new Soviet-controlled operational depth across right-bank Ukraine. The resistance and adaptation phase of the Zhitomir-Berdichev winter offensive developed between 15 and 20 January 1944, as German forces attempted to preserve operational coherence during retreat, while Soviet formations adapted their offensive methods to extended winter pursuit operations. After the fall of Berdichev and the collapse of the last organized German defensive belt east of Vinnytsia, the character of fighting shifted from breakthrough battles to fluid engagements dominated by delaying actions, mobile rearguards, and rapid Soviet exploitation across a widening front. German resistance during this phase relied on flexible rearguard formations built around remaining armored units, assault gun detachments, and motorized infantry battalions. These mobile groups established short-lived blocking positions along river lines, forest edges, and road junctions to delay Soviet advance columns. Typical delay positions held for 6 to 12 hours before withdrawal. Between 15 and 18 January, German rearguards executed more than 40 such actions across the Novohrad-Volhynsky, Koziatin, and Uman road sectors. These actions slowed Soviet daily advance rates to approximately 8 to 12 kilometers in areas where terrain narrowed vehicular movement. Soviet adaptation focused on maintaining forward momentum despite growing logistical strain. Tank and mechanized units increasingly relied on direct battlefield resupply rather than rear echelon depots. Fuel and ammunition were redistributed from captured German stockpiles whenever possible. Soviet engineers shifted to rapid road-clearing operations, removing snowdrifts, destroyed vehicles, and collapsed bridges under fire. Engineer battalions installed over 90 temporary timber and ice-reinforced crossings between 15 and 20 January to sustain armored movement across frozen streams and floodplains. Infantry tactics also evolved, rifle divisions advancing behind mechanized spearheads began employing dispersed formation movement to reduce losses from German artillery and air attack. Battalion-level maneuver replaced regiment-scale assaults in forested terrain, while ski detachments and mobile reconnaissance patrols were used to identify gaps in German rearguard screens. These measures reduced Soviet infantry casualties compared to earlier peak combat phases, though daily losses remained significant at 1,000 to 1,400 killed and wounded across the sector. Psychological pressure intensified on both sides. German troops faced continuous retreat under extreme cold with no stabilized fallback line. Frostbite, fuel shortages, and equipment loss eroded effective combat strength. German medical reports from the 4th Panzer Army documented over 6,000 cold-related casualties between mid and late January, many resulting in permanent loss of combat capability. Soviet troops endured similar exposure, but operated within a framework of forward momentum and frequent access to liberated settlements, which slightly mitigated shelter and supply conditions. Civilian involvement increased as front lines moved rapidly westward. In newly liberated districts, civilians provided ad hoc logistical assistance to Soviet units, including road clearing, casualty transport using sleds, and local reconnaissance. German evacuation detachments attempted to force westward population displacement in selected zones, particularly near rail corridors supporting retreat. Between 16 and 22 January, an estimated 45,000 civilians were displaced westward under German orders, while similar numbers returned to liberated towns behind Soviet lines. German command attempted limited adaptation through selective counter-concentration of remaining armored assets. On 17 January, a mobile group composed of elements from the 19th Panzer Division and 25th Panzer Grenadier Division briefly counterattacked near the village of Kalinivka. The action involved approximately 40 operational German armored vehicles and temporarily disrupted Soviet supply columns. The counterattack was contained within 24 hours after Soviet artillery regrouped and destroyed more than 15 German vehicles. Soviet losses in this localized engagement reached approximately 600 killed and wounded. Aerial operations during this phase declined in scale due to weather and logistical exhaustion. Soviet air forces continued to fly reconnaissance and limited close support missions when weather permitted. German air activity was restricted primarily to transport and emergency interdiction flights covering retreat corridors. Between 15 and 20 January, total combined air sorties in the sector fell by more than 50% compared to the peak week earlier in the month. By 20 January 1944, the resistance and adaptation phase had run its course. German forces no longer attempted to restore frontline stability east of the Bug River approaches. Soviet forces had fully adjusted to pursuit operations under winter conditions, sustaining pressure through continuous forward movement, decentralized logistics, and flexible infantry armor cooperation. The operational tempo now shifted toward the decisive turning point, where the German retreat would transform from organized displacement into large-scale operational withdrawal across the southern sector of the Eastern Front. The turning point of the Zhitomir-Berdichev winter offensive emerged between 21 and 26 January 1944, when the cumulative pressure of continuous Soviet pursuit forced the German 4th Panzer Army into a full operational withdrawal toward the southern Bug River line. By this stage, German resistance no longer aimed at stabilizing the front east of Vinnytsia, but at preserving the integrity of retreating formations before deeper encirclement could occur. The operational initiative had shifted permanently to the Red Army. On 21 January, forward elements of the 1st Guards Tank Army reached the eastern approaches to Vinnytsia after advancing more than 160 kilometers from their original December jump-off positions west of Kiev. This advance severed the last reliable lateral supply corridor linking German forces still retreating from the Novohrad-Volhynsky region with those falling back from the Berdichev zone. German formations west of Zhitomir and south of Novohrad-Volhynsky were now withdrawing on divergent axes under the threat of local encirclement. German command ordered a general phased retreat toward the Bug defensive line beginning on 22 January. The withdrawal involved elements of the 4th Panzer Army and parts of the 1st Panzer Army operating farther south. More than 18 divisions were engaged in staggered movement over a front exceeding 300 kilometers. Rear guards composed of assault guns, anti-tank battalions, and mobile infantry delayed Soviet mechanized spearheads at key road junctions and river crossings. These delaying actions typically lasted between 6 and 18 hours before German units disengaged under darkness or artillery cover. On 23 to 24 January, Soviet mobile formations began crossing the upper reaches of the Horen and Sluk rivers using a combination of ice-reinforced crossings and rapidly assembled bridges. German engineers attempted demolitions but were increasingly unable to destroy crossings in time due to the speed of the Soviet advance. Between 22 and 25 January, Soviet forces constructed more than 60 temporary river crossings in the offensive zone, enabling continued armored maneuver in areas previously considered non-navigable in winter conditions. German losses during the turning point phase increased primarily through material attrition. Between 21 and 26 January, German records indicate the loss of approximately 110 to 140 tanks and assault guns, most of them abandoned due to fuel exhaustion, mechanical failure, or the inability to evacuate damaged vehicles under pursuit. Soviet armored losses during the same period are estimated at 70 to 90 tanks and self-propelled guns, largely from anti-tank artillery and minefields covering retreat routes. Infantry casualties continued at an average rate of 2,000 to 2,500 killed and wounded per day across both sides combined. Civilian conditions deteriorated rapidly in the withdrawal corridor. German evacuation orders were issued for additional towns along the Vinnytsia and Nemyriv rail axes. Between 22 and 27 January, an estimated 60,000 civilians were displaced westward under German control, many without organized shelter or food provision. Soviet commissions later recorded additional civilian fatalities during this period caused by exposure, artillery fire, and destruction of housing during rearguard demolitions. On 25 January, Soviet forward units entered the eastern suburbs of Vinnytsia after German demolition teams destroyed rail yards, bridges, and warehousing facilities during the final withdrawal. The city fell under full Soviet control within 48 hours, following successive infantry assaults supported by self-propelled artillery. German losses during the defense and evacuation of Vinnytsia are estimated at approximately 4,000 killed and wounded, with more than 2,000 taken prisoner. Soviet casualties during the city fighting reached approximately 6,500 killed and wounded. The capture of Vinnytsia marked the definitive operational turning point of the Zhitomir-Berdichev winter offensive. With the loss of the last major urban strongpoint east of the Bug River, German forces no longer possessed the infrastructure required to support sustained defensive operations in central right bank Ukraine. Their strategic posture shifted from organized elastic defense to large-scale withdrawal across the southern sector of the Eastern Front. The outcome of the winter offensive was now decided not in isolated battles, but through the irreversible collapse of the German defensive system across the region. The aftermath and withdrawal phase of the Zhitomir-Berdichev winter offensive unfolded between 27 January and the first days of February 1944, as the German 4th Panzer Army completed its retreat toward the southern Bug and Dniester River defensive lines under continuous Soviet pressure. By this stage, German formations were no longer attempting to regain lost terrain, but focused exclusively on extracting remaining combat-capable units, wounded personnel, and essential equipment from the collapsing central Ukrainian front. Between 27 and 31 January, German rearguards conducted a sequence of compressed delaying actions along the approaches to the Bug River. These actions were organized around remaining assault gun battalions, anti-tank units, and motorized infantry companies supported by limited artillery fire. Holding periods shortened further, with most delay positions abandoned after 4 to 8 hours of resistance. March distances frequently exceeded 25 kilometers per day, with minimal food allocation. Post-war Soviet assessments indicate that several thousand prisoners died during these evacuation marches due to exhaustion, exposure, and untreated wounds. Civilian conditions during the withdrawal phase were marked by the near-total destruction of administrative infrastructure in many towns. German demolitions targeted rail facilities, power stations, water pumping systems, and food storage depots. In multiple district centers, Housing destruction exceeded 60% due to combined demolition and artillery fire. Soviet military administrations entering these zones in early February reported acute shortages of food, medical supplies, and shelter for returning civilian populations. The Soviet command began transitioning from offensive exploitation to operational consolidation at the turn of the month. By 1 February, forward Soviet units reached the eastern banks of the Southern Bug across several sectors, but did not immediately attempt large-scale river crossings. Engineer units focused on bridge construction, mine clearance, and restoration of damaged roads. Rifle divisions were withdrawn from continuous pursuit into short periods of reorganization after more than 5 weeks of sustained combat. German forces established a provisional defensive line along the western bank of the Bug River, reinforced by residual elements of both the 4th and 1st Panzer Armies. The line was uneven, thinly held, and dependent on natural barriers rather than prepared fortifications. German infantry strength west of the Bug in early February had declined to an average of 45–50% of authorized manpower in most divisions. Armored strength fell below 40 operational vehicles per panzer division in several sectors. Combat losses during the final withdrawal phase remained significant. Between 27th of January and 4th February, Soviet units reported approximately 18,000 killed and wounded across the pursuit sector. German losses during the same period are estimated at approximately 10,000 to 12,000 killed, wounded, and missing, with a continuing imbalance favoring material loss over personnel casualties. By the first week of February 1944, the battlefield phase of the Zhitomir-Berdichev winter offensive had ended. The Red Army had advanced between 120 and 180 kilometers across central right bank Ukraine since late December. German forces, though still partially cohesive, had been forced into a general withdrawal beyond the immediate operational zone of the offensive. What remained was the long-term process of recovery, occupation administration in liberated territories, and the preparation for the next, even larger Soviet strategic operations aimed at dismantling the remaining German defensive system west of the Dnieper. At the same time, Soviet security organs initiated large-scale counterintelligence and filtration operations in liberated areas, subjecting returning civilians and former prisoners of war to political screening. The German command assessed the winter defeat in Ukraine as a critical structural failure of Army Group South. Field Marshal Manstein's repeated requests for operational freedom to conduct elastic defense were increasingly overridden by directives enforcing rigid holding of individual positions. This contradiction between mobile defense doctrine and political interference contributed to the inability of German forces to establish a coherent winter stabilization line in 1944. In the broader framework of the Eastern Front, the Zhitomir-Berdichev offensive directly prepared the operational conditions for the subsequent Korsun-Shevchenkovsky encirclement in February 1944 and the spring offensives toward the Dniester and the Carpathians.